Okay, good morning, people, or good afternoon, actually. So let's fill in the last part of the notes, and you're going to use this coming up. So make sure you keep your notes out. We're going to talk about reforms that happened during the Industrial Revolution. If you reform something, you change it to make it better. So these are some of the ways that some people during the Industrial Revolution tried to address problems. Okay, so the Luddites, if you look at that picture in the background, you got a couple men who are taking sledgehammers to machines. They were called Luddites, taken from a character from Robin Hood. They smashed the machines because they believed that the machines and the system that was emerging, the capitalist system that was emerging, was taking away their livelihood. Because these machines could do the jobs that they used to do weaving by hand. So this was symbolic. There's no way that they could destroy all the machines and all the factories in England, but they could make a demonstration out of destroying some of these machines as an act of resistance. So most of these attacks happened in the most industrialized areas of England, right in that triangle. This is a wanted poster offering a reward for anybody who would turn in Luddites. I couldn't think of any really good examples of Luddites, modern Luddites, but they're in the past people who were scared that computers were going to take away jobs from people. Think about when you go to Walmart and you have the self checkouts now that used to be operated by human beings. That might be an example, and if people resist it, that might be an act that's sort of like what a Luddite would do. Okay, in 1819, early on, some British workers resisted and protested their treatment in the factory system, and the government called out soldiers, and the soldiers fired on the workers, killing some of them. Now, some of those workers saw themselves as essentially like slaves because whereas before, when they worked at home in cottage industry, they worked for their own benefit. Now they were working in mills and factories for the profit of somebody else rather than themselves. Okay, in 1832, the people who called themselves Chartists were successful in pushing through an agenda to help the lower class. So, in this Reform Bill of 1832 that passed Parliament in England, these are some of the things that they got: universal male suffrage. All the voting districts were equal, so that they didn't favor areas where upper class people lived. They abolished the requirement that members of parliament be property owners, so that helped the lower classes, many of whom didn't really own property. And along those same lines, they made it so that you got paid to serve in parliament. Before, only wealthy people could afford to do that because they didn't need to have that income. Annual elections and a secret ballot. We take that for granted here, but that was new. What that meant was if you voted, nobody else knew how you voted. So people in power, if they found out, couldn't hold it against you. So Chartists included women as well. Okay, England had these laws that they called the Corn Laws that raised tariffs on imports from other countries. So that forced people to buy from at home. Now, the downside with that is that raises prices because there isn't competition. So the people who were against the Corn Laws, the tariffs, were the Anti-Corn Law League. They wanted to give smaller manufacturers more opportunities to sell their products through competition. And they said it would expand employment, lower the prices, help agriculture within England, and as I said, increase competition. And they also said that by trading more with other countries, because if you put up big tariffs, sort of like what we're doing right now with China, that can lead to conflict. So their argument was, if you take down those trade barriers, those tariffs, and you more freely trade with other countries, it's going to lead to peace between countries, because it's in their both countries' interest to avoid conflict so that they can both profit from economic trade. Okay, so the government responded. They abolished slavery, but notice the reason for this. It wasn't for the lofty ideals of the French Revolution, equality and fraternity. This was because they concluded that slavery actually lowered wages for people, especially at the bottom, in England. So in 1832, they abolished slavery. And a year later, they created the Sadler Commission to investigate working conditions in the factories. And out of that came the Law of the Factory Act, and that limited child labor. So putting limits on hours, on the treatment of kids, and so forth. And then the following year, they passed the Poor Law, and that created the poorhouses or workhouses, where if you couldn't provide for yourself, you could go to the poorhouse, miserable conditions, but you could get some food and you could live there and have some shelter. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead. Even though they in the Bill of 1832, supposedly they created universal male suffrage, you can see that they started off before 1832 with only 2% of the population voting. Even by 1884, you still only have about 14% of England's population that's actually voting. Modernism. Modernism was a new thought process where artists and authors rebelled against the traditions that had been there since the Renaissance. So you're throwing some of those traditions out and you're moving towards this. In literature, more realism. So they talked about the problems happening in society, like life in the slums, alcoholism, inequalities for women, those type of issues. In art, in paintings, you got the Impressionists, who focused on nature, the Post-Impressionists, who used color as a way to convey language, and Vincent van Gogh is a great example, probably the greatest of the Post-Impressionists. And then you have the abstract artists, and their stuff is a little harder, at least for me, to understand when I look at it. You'll see an example in a minute. But abstract art is all about not only color, but the use of lines. So for the Impressionists, this is Claude Monet. You see a lot of pastel colors. Same thing here with the Post-Impressionists. So this is Vincent van Gogh. Now we get into the abstract art, and you'll see it's different. Maybe not so much this one on the right side, but definitely up here. And here's a great example from Kandinsky, another abstract artist. If these are for sale, people pay hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions for these. To me, I don't really get it, but then again, maybe I don't have the best understanding of art and appreciation of it. In architecture, they moved away from like Gothic style, where you had all kinds of ornamentation on buildings. For modernists, when you're building buildings, when you're constructing them, everything that's on that building should have a purpose. If it doesn't have a purpose, it shouldn't be on there. So they use steel and to build these things, and this is where we get skyscrapers. And if you look at skyscrapers from that period, they don't have ornamentation on it. They're relatively plain in their appearance. That's modernism. In science, we see women start to emerge, like Marie Curie. So she discovered the element radium, which gives off radiation. Albert Einstein, who was German but eventually moved to the United States, came up with the theory of relativity, that space and time are not absolute but are relative. So you get ideas that are challenging Einstein's ideas, which are challenging long-held beliefs. In economics, Thomas Malthus, He believed that population was going to keep growing and our food supply wouldn't be able to keep up, so we would get mass starvation and famine. One of the reasons he's famous is because his predictions didn't come true. So he thought that the only things that would limit population were war, disease, and widespread famine. Those are the only things that could control population. But what's actually happened is the food supply, like in the United States, we waste tons and tons of food just every day that gets thrown out. Now, you can go to certain countries in Africa and you can see that mass starvation and famine, but it hasn't played out the way that Malthus predicted. David Ricardo came up with the iron law of wages, and he pointed this out. In studying history, he saw that when wages went up, people felt more comfortable having more kids because they could afford to do it. Now the dilemma was this, according to him. As more children are born, as the birth rate goes up, wages go down because it produces more people and more people working. And businesses can afford to drop wages because there's plenty of people to choose from to work for you. In psychology, Sigmund Freud is the most famous figure from this time period. So he thought that all our behaviors are driven by our memories and these thoughts that are below the surface in our unconscious. So if at that time you went in to see a psychoanalyst, what they would do is they would want to know about dig into your memories and try and unlock those thoughts that are way below the surface and repressed. And that's how you dealt with your psychological issues. Most people did not go to psychologists in those days. There was a real stigma about that, especially if you were a man. You weren't supposed to go to see a psychologist. Now, today, most psychiatrists did not subscribe to most of the beliefs of Sigmund Freud, but there are some ideas that came from Freud that are still present in psychology today. But it was an important early step. In philosophy, you've got Jeremy Bentham. So he advanced this idea of utilitarianism. So policies in society should be driven by what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And at that time, the greatest number of people were in the lower classes. So he said government should play an active role in trying to help people at the bottom by creating programs that you might call social safety nets that help people not sink into poverty or help pull them out of poverty. Now this, what you see this picture down here, underneath those clothes is the skeleton, the real skeleton of Jeremy Bentham. When he was 21, he wrote a will. And in this will, he made it clear that he wanted his friend, who was a surgeon, to dissect him when he died, because Bentham was just a very curious man, believed in science. He wanted his body to be used for the purposes of better understanding human beings. This is also his real head here. So in this picture over to the right, underneath the clothing are his bones, his skeleton, his full skeleton. But the head is actually made of wax, so that's not really his head, but it does have some of his real hair on it. If you look down here, let me drag this down. If you look between his feet, for a time his real head was kept there. But then in 1975, some college kids stole his head as a joke, and they held it, quote unquote, for ransom. And they didn't give it back until the college made a donation to a charity. And then they gladly handed it over again. Now it's kept in a box. And again, on the left here, that's his real head. Because it's kind of disturbing, they long ago decided that they weren't going to display it on top of his body. But he had a great sense of humor, and he joked that one of the reasons why he wanted his body to be preserved, mummified like that, and then put out on display is so that his friends could stop by and chat with him every now and then when they wanted to, even after he died. Okay, last couple things. So with some people, they wanted to radically change society in the way that wealth was distributed to people. They wanted to redistribute it. And Karl Marx is the most famous person connected with this. So he wrote the Communist Manifesto. And his prediction was in every country that industrialized, eventually the workers were going to rebel against the entrepreneurs, the capitalists who own the factories. And they were going to take all that capital, all that wealth, and they were going to redistribute it equally to the people. And why is that important? Because he said what that would lead to are classless societies. Classes would vanish if everybody has basically the same amount of wealth. So he predicted that this revolution was inevitable. So it would happen in England, it would happen in eventually in the United States. Well, that didn't happen. We did get communist revolutions in Russia and China, and with some really disastrous results with tens of millions of people murdered by the state. But some of his observations about industrialization were pretty accurate about how workers were exploited. So socialists and Marxists believe that rather than having individuals own the means of production, the factories, the nation as a whole should control those factories so that they could more equally distribute the wealth to people. Because they didn't just want the rich and the well-connected to be successful and comfortable in life. They wanted society to benefit everybody, most especially the people at the bottom. So some of them tried to build utopias, so perfect worlds, perfect communities. There was even an Englishman who came over to the United States and started a utopia, a city in Indiana where all the work, everybody had a job, wealth was distributed basically equally among the workers, but it just didn't last. It didn't work. And there were others like that. Okay, one of the dark sides during the Industrial Revolution, one of the darkest things was social Darwinism. Social Darwinists took Charles Darwin's idea of natural selection, which some people express as survival of the fittest, and they applied it to human beings. So social Darwinists looked out at the world and they saw some countries were doing really well and some countries were not at all. And they took Darwin's ideas and they said, okay, just like in individual species, you have some organisms that survive and some that don't, because some are better adapted to their environment than others. And the ones that don't adapt die out. And that also explains why some whole species die out, because they aren't able to adapt. Well, social Darwinists looked at human beings and they said, these groups over here, those groups over there, the reason why they struggle is because they aren't adapted to their environments and they are less fit. And think about it, when we're talking about animals and Darwinism, when certain organisms die out because they aren't well adapted, you can look at that as a good thing because they're not passing on their genes, they're not creating other weaker organisms, and only the strongest organisms are able to survive, and then they have new generations of offspring, right? You apply that to human beings, you get some really dark things that can happen where you just want certain groups to survive and repopulate and not other ones. So you can see where that's going. Some of those ideas are present, like with the Nazis and Hitler, and only the fit people should reproduce and the unfit should not. So it was used as a justification for some nations to colonize and dominate others and take resources from them. Also during this time, something more positive, since throughout history Jews had been persecuted, there was a movement that started during the Industrial Revolution called Zionism, pushing for a Jewish state, a separate state for Jews, mostly to protect them against persecution so that that could stop. Eventually, that leads to the creation of the nation of Israel. But that's after World War II, so it's after the Holocaust where they finally get that. Last images here. You can see the areas that were most industrialized by 1850. Definitely England here, France, Belgium, over here in Germany, down here in Switzerland. But you can see Russia, not really industrialized, except for like at St. Petersburg. The Scandinavian countries, not so much, but a little bit in Sweden. So it would take still more time before you see all of Western Europe and Russia become industrialized. And Russia had always been behind. And the United States industrializes after England. Here's a look at the countries over that time span and their industrialization. So at the top, the UK or England, and then Germany and France and so forth. The United States was down here. But keep in mind, as we get further into the 1900s, US ends up here. And still to this day, the US has the most powerful economy in the world, the biggest economy in the world, although China is catching up. Okay, so make sure you filled in these notes. Then you're gonna, you guys have been doing a really good job with the in-class assignments. That's been working well. So you need to keep doing that today and get those sheets done that are going to be passed out to you. Keep the notes outline out. It's going to help you on that first page where you pick out what were three problems of the Industrial Revolution, and what do you think were some solutions to it that they came up with. And then go through those other 4 documents, answer the questions, and turn that in, and you're good to go. If you get to that point, make sure that you turned in your sheets from last time. Most of you did. And then if you got everything done, go through Quizlet or Kia or any of the review games that I got on my webpage. Okay. We will plan for Wednesday to be mostly a review day. And then on Friday, we'll plan on taking a test on the Industrial Revolution. So I'll see you on Wednesday.